The Acts of the Apostles is vital to the overall credibility of the New Testament. It alone provides a historical account of the development of the early church immediately after Jesus' ministry. Unsurprisingly, there are diverse opinions on the reliability of Acts. One gentleman called F.F. Bruce claimed that Luke's reputation as a historian is unsurpassed. So that's pretty positive. Whereas the Acts Seminar claims that Acts is a 2nd century document that reflects the nature of the church at that time. So who is right? This is the structure of my talk. I'll provide a brief overview of Acts and then discuss the early manuscripts, the we passages, who wrote it, when it was written, key developments in scholarship on Acts, arguments for and against its reliability, then why the divergence in opinion, and finally where do we go from here? First of all, an overview. Acts is the 5th book in the New Testament. It describes some of the acts of Jesus' disciples from the time of Jesus' claimed resurrection up until 62 AD. So I'll discuss why did Luke write Acts, what does it describe, and the unity between Luke and Acts. So why did Luke write it? Initially, the book of Acts probably did not have a title. It is now referred to as the Acts of the Apostles, or just Acts. The 4 Gospels are about the life of Jesus, and Acts is the sequel to the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Luke. So why did Luke write Acts? He doesn't explicitly say. Various suggestions are that it was to tell the story of the birth and growth of the church, or that it was the fulfillment of Jesus' promise at his ascension when he said, "You'll receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the earth." So it shows the progression of the gospel from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then finally to Rome. Or finally, that it was to explain how the gospel message spread to the Gentiles, which was a very contentious issue at the time. The content of Acts is approximately as follows. Jesus gives the disciples a commission to wait for the Holy Spirit and to be witnesses to his resurrection. The disciples then receive power through the Holy Spirit and commence preaching in Jerusalem. Persecution from the Jewish leadership then causes the Christians to be scattered into Judea and Samaria, where they continue to preach. Some Gentiles then start to receive the gift of the Spirit. Luke then describes Paul's missionary journeys until Paul is sent to Rome to appear before Caesar. There's almost universal acceptance that the same person is the author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts. And this is evident from the introductions to each book. The first 4 verses in Luke commence as follows. "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished amongst us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught." Then the first 3 verses in Acts are, "In this book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach, until the day when he was taken up, after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. He presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God." So both books are addressed to Theophilus, who may have been his patron. Acts refers back to the first book, which presumably is Luke. So there's not much argument over that. Now I'm going to talk about the manuscript basis for Acts. So before we can discuss the reliability of the content, we have to consider whether we can know what the content was. The purpose of textual criticism is to establish the original text from the manuscript evidence. I've previously given a talk on the New Testament manuscripts. This provides a very brief summary of some of that content with a particular focus on Acts. So we'll discuss text types and the actual manuscripts for Acts. And I'll go through each of those, so I need to listen now. First of all, text types. The New Testament manuscripts are those handwritten manuscripts that we have prior to the printing press. And the New Testament manuscripts are classified in accordance with three types. And they are listed here: Alexandrian, Western and Byzantine. And these represent the regions within the Roman Empire where they were centred. So we have Alexandria here in the north of Egypt. Western is over here somewhere. Yeah. And Byzantium is around about here where Constantinople is. So it's Greece. First of all, the Alexandrian text type. Alexandrian manuscripts are from the region of Alexandria in Egypt. So you can see that there on your map, on the map. They are early and well regarded. The Alexandrian copyists used a carefully controlled copying process, and these copies are the basis for most modern translations. Western text type. The Western text types are also called Caesarean because Rome was in the western part and Rome had Caesars. And they are very early texts from the Western Roman Empire in the regions of North Africa, Italy and Gaul. So Gaul corresponds roughly to modern day France. They are less well controlled and use frequent paraphrases and corruptions. Byzantine texts are also called Koine, since they were recorded in the Koine Greek language. They are later traditions and constitute 95% of all manuscripts. They have the most paraphrases and additions and were the basis for most Reformation era translations, such as the King James Version. So given that background information on text types, which do you think scholars would prefer? Alexandrian, yeah, okay. Very good. This slide summarises the earliest major manuscripts for the book of Acts, which we'll discuss in more detail in the next few slides. So they are P45, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Bezae. P45 is the earliest major manuscript for Acts. It was discovered in Egypt, was produced in about 250 AD. So generally the date's 200 to 250 AD. The original codex would have contained 220 pages, of which only 30 survive. It contains sections from the four Gospels and Acts chapters 4 to 17, and it is an Alexandrian text type, so it's highly regarded. Codex Sinaiticus is now also an Alexandrian text type. It contains most of the New Testament, including Acts, and it was written in the 4th century and is now held in the British Museum. Codex Vaticanus is also an Alexandrian text type. It contains most of the New Testament, including Acts. So these are the first copies, complete copies of the New Testament, or nearly the whole New Testament. It was written in the 4th century and is now held in the Vatican, hence the name Codex Vaticanus. Codex Bezae Cantabrigensis. The name of this manuscript comes from the fact that Theodore Beza, that's where you get Bezae, donated this manuscript to the Cambridge University in 1581. The manuscripts that we've discussed prior to this have all been Alexandrian. But Codex Bezae is a Western text type, and it dates from the 5th century, and it is 8% longer than the Alexandrian version, so it's got additions into it. Most of the additions are harmless, and I'll just present an example from just a single verse, Acts 19 verse 9. So this is from the ESV, or English Standard Version. So in the main body of the text it says, "But when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the way before the congregation, he," that is Paul, "withdrew from them and took the disciples with him, reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus." And it's got a little note there, see. So the ESV includes a footnote, which is actually based on the Western text type. So it says some manuscripts add from the 5th hour to the 10th. Okay, so that's the sort of thing you get added in the Western text type tradition. We passages. So before we discuss authorship and dating, I'll discuss the role of the author. Where was he in relationship to the events? One of the interesting features of Acts is the we passages. For most of Acts, Luke writes in the 3rd person, which is he, them, etc., referring to the people's activities using pronouns such as he, she, or they. However, from chapter 16 onwards, there are 3 distinct passages where Luke changes from the 3rd person plural to the 1st person plural, from they to we. He starts to say we and us, and here is where the transition actually starts in Acts chapter 16. So initially it's 3rd person. And they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So the passage initially refers to they, and then suddenly transitions to we and us. So here are the 3 we passages. There's the first one is fairly short, just from verses 10 to 17 in Acts 16, and that's during Paul's travels from Troas to Philippi. Then, as soon as Paul leaves Philippi, they stop. And there's for 4 chapters. Then they recommence in Acts chapter 20 from Philippi to Jerusalem. Then they stop. And then in Acts 27, it's from Caesarea to Rome. In Acts 16, the we passages occur from Troas in Turkey. So, take my glasses off. There's Troas there. And you can see the purple line. That's going to Neapolis and then to Philippi. The we passages occur from Troas in Turkey. It wasn't called Turkey at the time. It was called Asia Minor or Anatolia. So Troas in Turkey to Philippi in Macedonia in about 49 AD, and it's shown in purple. After Paul leaves Philippi, the we passages abruptly stop. Paul travels through Macedonia, Greece, returns to Jerusalem, and then to Syrian Antioch. So, whoops, no. So here it is. There's Troas, goes up to Philippi, comes down to Athens, Corinth, goes across to Ephesus, then back to, lands at Caesarea, goes down to Jerusalem, back up to Antioch, which was his missionary base. Later, Paul commences his 3rd missionary journey, which is in red, through Turkey and then to Macedonia. So you can see here it is in red, coming up through here, comes up there, gets back to Philippi. When he reaches Philippi, the wee passages recommence. The intermission would have taken several years. The wee passages are then sustained for Paul's travels through to Greece, back to Macedonia, and the sea voyage back to Jerusalem, arriving in about 857 AD. So here he is, he's in Philippi in red, goes down to Corinth, comes back up, goes through Macedonia again, and then comes all the way here, lands here at Tyre, and gets to Jerusalem. Paul visits the temple in Jerusalem. There is a riot and Paul is arrested. At this point, the wee passages stop. Paul is taken to Caesarea and kept in prison for 2 years, and this time can be dated to 57 to 59 AD. And the reason we can date that is because initially Felix was in charge and he was replaced by Festus. So that allows us to actually date the events. Paul is then tried in Caesarea. As a Roman citizen, he appeals to Caesar and is sent by Caesar to Rome. As soon as this journey starts, the wee passages recommence for the third time, and it is wee all the way to Rome. So here it is. So, got the green. And this is the famous sea voyage, which is recorded in Acts 27. Lands there, goes to Rome, he's under house arrest. The story stops. The use of we is very natural and nonchalant to such a degree that most readers do not notice it. I know of one Bible study group who studied Acts for a whole year and never noticed it. I've been a Christian and reading the Bible for 50 years, but only became aware of the wee passages about 5 years ago when someone pointed it out. However, once you know what to look for, it is as clear as a bell. There are at least 4 theories to account for the wee passages. 1. Luke accompanied Paul during his missionary journeys. Number 2. They are a literary device to describe sea voyages. Number 3. They represent an earlier source that the author included. Number 4. The use of we is a cunning plan to give the impression of an eyewitness account, but really it's a complete forgery. That's good old Bart Ehrman. I like Bart Ehrman, actually. The first explanation is the common sense and obvious explanation. Luke joined Paul in Troas and accompanied Paul to Philippi. When Paul left Philippi, Luke stayed there, perhaps to help the Philippian church. After several years, Paul returned to Philippi and Luke then joined him on his journey back to Jerusalem. When Paul was arrested and imprisoned in Caesarea, Luke stayed with the Jerusalem church. This would have been a great opportunity to interview eyewitnesses and develop his gospel. When Paul was sent to Rome, Luke then accompanied him. The sea voyage, storm and shipwreck on the island of Malta is described vividly in Acts chapter 27. Its vividness, the level of detail and contextual accuracy screams at us as a testimony of an eyewitness. Paul and his companions are then put on a different ship, land in Italy near Naples, and then travel by land to Rome, where Paul is kept in house arrest for 2 years. At this point, the book of Acts ends. During this time, it would have been a great opportunity for Luke to write Acts. What happens to Paul after this is unclear. However, when he was close to death, he writes, "Luke alone is with me." It all fits together. The second theory was proposed by Vernon Robbins in 1978. He proposed that the wee passages are a Greek rhetorical device used for sea voyages. However, this view has been overwhelmingly rejected by scholars. The reasons include: 1, there is not convincing evidence that such a device ever existed, And number two, the we passages were also used on land as well as sea, which you can see from the map. The third theory is that the we passages are where the author is using an earlier source. If this theory were true, then the we passages still represent an eyewitness source. Besides this, there is no evidence for an earlier prior source. So it's a little pie in the sky. The fourth theory was proposed by Bar Ehrman in his book Forged. His view is not widely supported. The we passages are too natural, nonchalant and unassuming to seem the product of a forgery. If they are a forgery, then they're a very good one. Authorship. The early church fathers claim that Luke wrote the third gospel and the book of Acts, and they do so universally. The first surviving explicit references to Luke as the author of Acts come from the 2nd century. And they are Irenaeus, Clement of Alexander, Tertullian and Origen. All attest to his authorship, and they do so in incidental ways, showing that in their day the point needed no argument. His authorship is also attested to in the Muratorian fragment and the anti-Marcionite prologue of Luke. The we passages also strongly point to the author as being a companion of Paul. For instance, Irenaeus states Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. And so this also applies to Acts as well. Luke is a minor figure in the New Testament, and so there's no compelling reason to oppose it. However, there is opposition to him being a companion of Paul, as this would increase Acts' credibility. A 2nd century date would also eliminate Luke as a possibility. So now we come to the dating of Acts. People always get excited when I start talking about dating, but perhaps for the wrong reason. The dating affects the reliability of Acts. The later, the less reliable. And there are three common views on the dating of Acts. The traditional and conservative view is that Acts was compiled between 60 and 62 AD while Paul was under house arrest in Rome. The common liberal view is that Acts was written about 85 AD, and the radical view is that Acts was written in the early 2nd century. And so we'll look at each dating argument. This is the argument for the early date. Acts finishes abruptly in 62 AD with Paul under house arrest in Rome for 2 years. And according to the we passages, Luke was with Paul. What happened after that? There are a lot of highly significant events. Paul would have had his trial before Caesar. That was the whole point of him going to Rome, to appear before Caesar. But it's not mentioned. Didn't get that far. The Neronian persecutions broke out in Rome in 64 AD. Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome in about 65 AD. James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred in Jerusalem. The Jewish wars against Roman occupation broke out in 66 AD. And the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And this was in accordance with Jesus' prophecy, and also ended the Jewish sacrificial system. What does Luke say about all this? Absolutely nothing. If he was writing much later, he would have mentioned such significant events. Therefore, it is reasonable to believe that Acts was completed prior to these events. People have suggested reasons why Luke did not mention them, but they are quite unconvincing. Does that sound a reasonable argument to you? Right, okay. Now, we'll look at the next one. The argument for a mid-80s dating goes something like this. Luke copied or paraphrased sections of Mark. And so Luke was written after Mark. That's fair enough, isn't it? I agree with that. Mark was written in 65 to 75 AD, and so Luke must have been written sometime after that. That's dubious. Mark, Matthew and Luke have accounts where Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. However, prophesying the future is impossible. Therefore, these words must have been attributed to Jesus after the event. Therefore, Luke could not have been written. Therefore, Luke could not have written Luke Acts until after the mid-80s. Does that sound reasonable? Right. Okay. Argument for a 2nd century dating. A 2nd century date was popular during the 19th century but largely died out during the 20th century. This was because archaeological discoveries demonstrated that Acts reflected a 1st century context. However, there's a small minority of scholars who have revived this view fairly recently. Richard Purvo, what a name, is a fellow of the West Star Institute. The West Star Institute sponsored the Jesus Seminar, which was quite controversial, and more recently the Acts Seminar. Purvo claims that Acts was written between 110 and 120 AD, and possibly as late as 130. His argument is that the author may have used Polycarp, who wrote in about 130 AD. Luke used a collection of Paul's letters and Josephus, because there's some overlap between Josephus and Acts, and also Luke. Josephus wrote the Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD, so Acts must be later than this. Orders of ministry and care of widows reflect a later date. Acts is moving towards a world of 2nd century apologists, such as Justin Martyr, whose writings date to about 150 AD. Reasonable argument? No answer came, the Stern replied. Right. Okay. Allusions by early church fathers. The early church fathers do not heavily quote the Gospels or the book of Acts until the time of Justin Martyr, just after 150 AD. However, there are some allusions to Acts from the earlier church fathers. This slide shows some of the allusions to the book of Acts and also the approximate date. These fathers only use similar phrases. Like they certainly don't say this is from Acts. So Clement uses the phrase, "It is more blessed to give than to receive," which is in Acts 20. The Epistle of Barnabas uses the phrase, "No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own," which is a phrase out of Acts. Ignatius says, "Each one shall go to his own place." So this is a phrase referring to the death of Judas. All right. Polycarp refers to Jesus Christ, who endured to face even death for our sins, whom God raised, having loosed the pangs, being loosed from the pangs of Hades. So that's a phrase out of Acts 2, which is one of Peter's sins. Polycarp also says that Jesus was appointed as judge of the living and the dead, which comes out of Acts 10. So how do you respond to these similarities?
Who copied who?
You've read my notes. Or you guessed. Very smart boy. So there are some allusions to Acts in the very early church fathers, but what does it mean? Are the fathers quoting Acts, or is Acts quoting the fathers? If Acts was written prior to the fathers, then why is it not quoted more? What do you think? Why haven't we got heaps of quotations in the very early church fathers of the Gospels and Acts?
Manuscripts.
Sorry?
Well, how early did the oral tradition go to being a written tradition, and how much was the written text available?
Yeah. This is hard to understand from a modern person, because as soon as we write something, we can publish it on the internet, can't we? And the whole world can see it. Surprisingly, they didn't have an internet back then. So we need to actually think about the first century context. The Gospels and Acts were initially written for a single church. This single copy would have been read out loud to the church. It would have taken some time before their value was realised. It would then take considerable time and money to create copies and distribute them to other churches. So the spread of these documents would have been much slower than what we experience. Right, now I'm going to look at kind of the history of scholarship on Acts. The scholarship on Acts is vast and cannot be covered here. I'll just give a short summary of some advocates on both sides of the debate. These are the Tübingen School, W.M. Ramsey, Colin Hemer, F.F. Bruce and the Acts Seminar. And this just demonstrates the extreme diversity in scholarly opinion. First of all, the Tübingen School. Prior to the Enlightenment, which was around about 200 to 300 years ago, Acts was accepted as a historical account. However, during the Enlightenment, there developed a stronger scepticism towards the supernatural. The Tübingen School of Theology was founded by Ferdinand Christian Bauer, and it's called Tübingen because he did it at the University of Tübingen. Tübingen was a town in Germany, and he was there during the 19th century. He believed that history must be based on philosophy, and he derived his thesis from Hegel's theories of history, as did Karl Marx. This means that his views were based on a philosophical prediction rather than hard evidence. He had a profound impact upon higher biblical criticism, and his major views were Paulinism, or the followers of Paul, was a schismatic movement in opposition to Peter and James. Simon Magus was a nickname for Paul. Marcion was the leader of the Pauline sect, since this is 2nd century stuff, and that the Acts of the Apostles was compiled in the 2nd century to reconcile Peter and Paul. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? All right. His views were dominant in the 19th century, peaking in the 1840s. However, his influence gradually lost ground in the face of historical fact. British scholars showed that his views were impossible and he fell into disrepute. Sir William Mitchell Ramsay is often referred to as W.M. Ramsay because William Mitchell was a mouthful. He had an enormous impact in the opposite direction. Ramsay was a Scottish archaeologist and New Testament scholar. By his death in 1939, he had become the foremost authority of his day on the history of Asia Minor and a leading scholar in the study of the New Testament. Ramsay was educated in the Tübingen School. However, his extensive archaeological and historical studies convinced him of the historical accuracy of the New Testament. When he first went to Asia Minor, many of the cities mentioned in Acts had no known location and almost nothing was known of their detailed history or politics. Acts was the only record, and Ramsay fully expected his own research to prove that the author of Acts to be hopelessly inaccurate, since no man could possibly know the details of Asia Minor more than 100 years after the event. This is when Acts was supposed to have been written. That was the common theory amongst scholars at the time. He therefore set out to put the right of Acts on trial. He devoted his life to unearthing the ancient cities and documents of Asia Minor. After a lifetime of studies, he concluded, further studies showed that the book of Acts could bear the most minute scrutiny as an authority for the facts of the Aegean world, and it was written with such judgment, skill, art and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. On page 89 of the same book, he said, I set out to look for truth on the borderland where Greece and Asia met, and found it there in Acts. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. This is kind of a more personal quotation from him, where he describes his progression in thought. I may fairly claim to have entered on this investigation without prejudice in favour of the conclusions which I now seek to justify to the reader. On the contrary, I began with a mind unfavourable to it, for the ingenuity and apparent completeness of the Tübingen theory had at one time quite convinced me. It did not then lie in my line of life to investigate the subject minutely, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvellous truth. In fact, beginning with a fixed idea that the work was essentially a 2nd century composition, and never relying on its evidence as trustworthy for the first century conditions, I gradually came to find it a useful ally in some obscure and difficult investigations. He goes on, Luke as a historian is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements trustworthy, he is possessed of a true historic sense. For the sake of time, I won't read the rest of that quote. But just to highlight the second point, a writer who proves to be exact and correct in one point will show the same qualities in other matters. So this statement raises an interesting point. If Luke is correct in what we can check, is he also right in what we cannot check?
Quirinius.
Sorry?
Quirinius.
We're getting to Quirinius.
Okay,
Colin Hemer. Colin Hemer extended Ramsay's work. He wrote the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history, and I've read most of it. This is a classic on the historical context of Acts. In it, he listed hundreds of examples that confirm Acts' historical accuracy. Frederick Fyvie Bruce is more commonly known as F.F. Bruce. He was a highly regarded conservative scholar and was a fellow of the British Academy. He strongly supported New Testament reliability. He states, using the methods which are used to test the accuracy of other ancient authors, Luke's reputation as a historian is unsurpassed. Okay, so far so good. Now the Acts seminar. We've heard glowing reviews from Luke's supporters, but there is another side. The Acts seminar was modelled on the Jesus seminar, both of which were sponsored by the West Star Institute. Their results were published in Acts and Christian Beginnings, the Acts Seminar Report in 2011. Like the Jesus Seminar, the Acts Seminar is a collection of opinions of a small group of selected scholars. The major findings of the Acts Seminar were: the use of Acts as a source for history has long needed critical reassessment. That's okay. Number two, Acts was written in the early decades of the 2nd century. The author of Acts used the letters of Paul as his source. Except for the letters of Paul, no other historically reliable source can be identified in Acts. Acts can no longer be considered an independent source for the life and mission of Paul. Contrary to Acts 1-7, Jerusalem was not the birthplace of Christianity. Acts constructs its story on the model of epic and related literature. The author of Acts creates names for characters as storytelling devices. Acts constructs its story to fit ideological goals. Acts is a primary historical source for the 2nd century Christianity. You comfortable with that? Maybe not. Okay. The report has attracted very little academic interest. Even though it was published in 2011, there are only 9 citations of the report in Google Scholar, which includes 4 self-citations. I know all about self-citations, I do it myself. Right. The report does not contain any arguments, only the results of the opinion survey. But the arguments are provided in previous reference reports. That's okay, all right? They provide their arguments in previous reports, and now they're just summarising the results in their published document. This does not stop the Acts Seminar from having significant influence, as the results have been embraced as a final word by anti-Christian groups. That's just how the world works. So, scholarly opinion is quite diverse. You can cherry pick whatever opinion you want. It is a bit meaningless. You have to look at the evidence and form your own opinion. So you shouldn't derive your opinions just by quoting people you like. In the following sections, I'll discuss the arguments against and for the reliability of Acts. Arguments against reliability. The arguments that are often raised against Luke and Acts reliability are claimed historical errors, contradictions between Acts and Paul's letters, the accuracy of the speeches and Acts, theological differences between Luke and Paul. For the sake of time, I'm not going to cover this, but to me it seems a fairly minor issue. The alleged historical errors that we're going to talk about are Quirinius and the census, the timing of Theudas' revolt, and the Egyptian. Quirinius. The problem with Quirinius is in the Gospel of Luke and not Acts, but it reflects Luke's reliability as a historian. Luke chapter 2 states, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all who went out to be registered, each to his own hometown." One writer said, "Oh, I just wish that Luke 1:2 was never there." Okay. The problem is that there appears to be a 10-year discrepancy. Luke and Matthew claim that Jesus was born in the time of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. But Quirinius was governor of Syria between 6 and 9 AD, and a major census was held in 6 AD, which was 10 years later than Herod. Possible explanations are Quirinius had an earlier term as governor, because there's a lot we don't know about Quirinius. The word when, because it says this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, can also be translated as before, but it's not as a natural translation. A census could take a long time to conduct. We do it in a single day, except for when the computer breaks down, don't we? It could, but in those times you didn't conduct a census in a single day. It could have been started in Herod's time, and Quirinius was the one who actually collated the results. And the fourth alternative, Luke was wrong. The other possibility is Josephus was wrong, because we get all the information about this from Josephus. Another problem is in Acts chapter 5. Peter and the apostles have been brought before the council who wanted to kill them, but Gamaliel warned them against this, and here is the account. A Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in honour by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men outside for a little while. And he said to them, "Men of Israel, take care what you're about to do with these men. For before these days Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census, and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. However, according to Josephus, Theudas led a revolt in 46 AD in the reign of Theudas, the Roman governor. But 46 AD is after the time of Gamaliel's speech, so that's an immediate problem, unless Gamaliel was a prophet. Also, Judas the Galilean led a revolt at the time of the census, which was in 6 AD. So, Theudas, in reality, it is claimed, came after Judas, not before him. So, possible explanations are there were many revolts, and Josephus makes a statement, there are many revolts that I did not mention. So, was there another Theudas? Another explanation is Josephus was wrong. And another possibility is that Luke was wrong. So these are the two major discrepancies that you often hear. And here's another one which is not as commonly cited. A further problem comes from Acts 22. A riot developed over Paul in Jerusalem, and he was brought before the Roman tribune. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness. In this account, the assassins were associated with a revolt led by an Egyptian. The assassins were called Sicarii, which means dagger men. They were Jewish terrorists who were active prior to the Jewish wars. But they were independent of the Egyptian revolt. Just a bit more on the Sicarii. What they did is they had daggers under their cloaks, they'd walk in amongst crowds, and they come across a Roman soldier or a Roman sympathiser, stick in the knife and duck off. But anyway, Josephus mentions both the Sicarii and the Egyptian, but they're separate things. Whereas here, they're associated. So possible explanations are that Luke incorrectly copied Josephus. So this is used as an argument for him copying Josephus and hence being late. All right. Luke used different sources from Josephus, or the Tribune made the mistake. The Tribune conflated the two groups, whether he did so deliberately or not. It's the sort of thing you do to malign a particular person, is to associate them with the Sicarii. Contradictions with Paul's letters. Paul wrote many letters to Christian churches, but in Acts, Luke makes no mention of them whatsoever. Regarding this, there are two common criticisms of Luke. One, that he did not know about them, and the other criticism is that he did. So you can't win, all right? Firstly, it's claimed that Luke was ignorant of Paul's letters and contradicts them. But others claim that Acts was contrived using Paul's letters. I think the first option is more likely than the second. Paul's first visit to Jerusalem is a possible example of conflict. In Galatians 1, Paul says he spent 3 years in Arabia before going to Jerusalem, but this is not mentioned in Acts chapter 9. I think it was quite likely that Luke had not seen Paul's letters before writing Acts. Paul would not have kept a copy of his letters. That would be expensive and time-consuming. Besides this, he often walked, and it would be difficult to carry them. Also, the letters would have taken years to be valued, copied and distributed to other churches, so it's unlikely that Luke would have seen them. Speeches. Over 25% of Acts contains a record of speeches, most of them on the slide. I won't read them out, you can quickly scan them. The issue is, how could Luke possibly record these speeches accurately? The answer is that the speeches are not a verbatim record of the actual speeches. The actual speeches were probably much longer. Luke only provided abbreviated summaries that reflected gist of what the speaker actually said. But in those times, that was considered quite acceptable. That's what mostly happened.
That's what we do today as well.
Yeah. Can you repeat verbatim what I've said so far? Would you want to? Right. Arguments for reliability. I'm now going to discuss arguments for the reliability of Acts, and they are external evidence, internal evidence, and the problem of disappearing problems. External evidence. This section summarises arguments for Luke's reliability. This includes knowledge of titles, geography and customs. His description of the status of provinces and the titles of their leaders is virtually perfect. This is extremely difficult to get right. For instance, Tacitus was a very highly regarded historian, yet he wrongly referred to Pilate as the procurator. He wasn't the procurator, he was the prefect. Ramsay writes, the officials with whom Paul and his companions brought in contact are those who would be there. Every person is found just where he ought to be. Proconsuls in senatorial provinces, Asiarchs in Ephesus, Strategoi in Philippi, Politarchs in Thessalonica, magicians and soothsayers everywhere. His accuracy in describing people, places, geography is well documented by Ramsay and Hema. And the number of confirmed claims, true claims, far outweigh his alleged errors. So his alleged errors were Quirinius, Theudas and the Egyptian. And there's hundreds of other things he got right. So in terms of comparing him with other historians, his hit ratio is a lot higher than other historians. Internal evidence. As well as external evidence, there's also internal evidence within the New Testament itself. Paul's letters and Acts frequently intersect. They corroborate each other without collaboration. An example is Paul's escape from Damascus. And their accounts of the same event in Acts and one of Paul's letters. I got this right? No? Let's see it. Yes. Whoops. Yes. So here's the passage from Acts. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates night and day in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. And the same event is described in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. At Damascus, the governor, under King Aretas, was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, so it's personal, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. All right, this is a test that you're still awake. Try to answer these questions. What is the same?
Most of it.
All right, listen.
What's
Can I give you a hint? Damascus?
Basket.
Basket?
Wall.
Wall? Letting it down out. And he escaped, didn't he?
yes, that's right.
All right. What are the differences?
The one's a king of the governor. It says
One says the governor, the other says
the Jews.
the Jews. All right.
That's probably our answer.
Okay. Are they describing the same event?
Presumably.
Seems like it, doesn't it?
That's
All right.
us.
Are the two, would you say that the two accounts are dependent or independent?
Independent. It's
Independent.
Yeah. Do they confirm each other?
Yep.
Can they be harmonised?
Yes.
How would you harmonise?
Well, the Jews wanted him killed. The governor under King Aretas was amenable to what they wanted.
Yeah, so they could have been in cahoots, couldn't they? All right. So I believe these are two independent accounts of the same event that are described from a different perspective. Does that seem fair enough? All right. There are numerous examples like this. They are called undesigned coincidences and are described in by William Paley and also by Lydia McGrew. Those are listed in the references at the final slide. Now the problem of disappearing problems. One passage in Acts that was highly disputed was Acts 14, 1-7 regarding the city of Iconium. The passage is as follows. Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both of Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel. Here Luke claims that Paul and his friends left Iconium and fled to Lycaonia. The problem was that the majority of our ancient authorities, such as Cicero, Strabo and Pliny, state that Iconium was in Lycaonia. So he left Lycaonia to go to Lycaonia. Doesn't make much sense. Thus Luke was supposedly wrong. However, the Roman writers reflected the point of view of Roman provincial administration. Xenophon, who marched with Cyrus's expedition through Phrygia into Lycaonia, calls Iconium the last city of Phrygia. Other ancient authorities speak of Iconium as Phrygian until far into the Roman imperial period. At the neighbouring city of Lystra, the natives used to speak the speech of Lycaonia. Two inscriptions in the Phrygian language that Ramsay found at Iconium in 1910 prove that the Phrygian language was in use there for 2 centuries after Paul's visits and afford confirmation of Acts 14. So Luke is reflecting the cultural situation rather than the Roman administrative border. And there are other examples of disappearing problems, like in Luke it talks about Jesus commencing his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius' reign? Yeah, 15th year of Tiberius' reign, when Pilate was governor, Caiaphas was high priest, and Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. And years ago, we only knew of one Lysanias, and he existed around about 60 years prior to that. And so people were saying, oh, that's an anachronism, you got that wrong. But later on they found an inscription which indicated there was a second Lysanias, and he was bang on that time. So the problems of actually in Luke Acts are actually decreasing as a result of archaeological evidence. So, given all this, why are opinions so divergent? And I'm going to just quickly summarise 4 items here: the nature of biblical scholarship, people's motives, people's assumptions, and bias. Nature of biblical scholarship. Liberal, critical or sceptical scholarship tends to mean something other than the literal meaning of the words. Liberal literally means generous, so are these generous scholars? But liberal scholarship means to adopt a perspective in accordance with some personalities in the Enlightenment who rejected the supernatural. Biblical criticism is the study and investigation of biblical writings. In its purest form, it does not necessarily mean criticising the Bible, but that is how it sometimes becomes. Skepticism entails questioning accepted truths, supposedly with the intent of discovering the actual truth. I have no problem with that, and I consider myself to be a sceptical person. Where it can go wrong is when it's applied in a biased way, only being sceptical about some things and accepting others without question. In this case, you ought to become sceptical about scepticism. Motives. Firstly, to get into scholarship, you virtually need a PhD, and PhDs have to be novel. This generally means that you need to have a thesis that is novel and is not obvious. So PhDs can be a denial of the obvious. There's also the desire for fame and to sell books. If you want to do this successfully, then you need to appeal to an audience. This can often be achieved by saying something outrageous or that which appeals to a particular audience. So be wary of people's motives. Assumptions. There is a wide diversity in opinion about Acts. Some believe that Acts is highly reliable and that Luke is one of the greatest historians, whereas others claim that it was written late and is highly unreliable in its depiction of the early church. Why is there such diversity of opinion? It seems highly related to the initial assumptions, which are also called presuppositions. If a person assumes that miracles are impossible, then they will inevitably conclude that Acts is unreliable. So here's a formal argument. Miracles are impossible. Acts contains miracle accounts. These miracle accounts must be false. Therefore, Acts is historically unreliable. That make sense? Good. Right. Bias. Everyone should acknowledge that we are all biased and tend to justify what we want to believe. It takes a very honest person to follow where the evidence truly leads. Conclusion. Opinion is diverse and it's also personal. Even though the evidence is in plain view and available to all, it depends on your assumptions and what you want to believe. My personal conviction is that the early dating is correct and that Acts is quite reliable. You may or may not agree with me. My take-home point is that you should not settle on an opinion based on an authority that you like, but do your homework and form your convictions from the evidence. If you don't examine the evidence for yourself, then really your opinion is worthless. A great place to start is to start in the middle. Spot all the we passages from chapter 16 onwards. Judge for yourself whether this reflects the genuine testimony of an eyewitness. Acts is a great read, so read it for yourself and make up your own mind. So, go forth and join us for supper.